Good afternoon, everyone. Oro University welcomes you to this online talk organized by the School of Liberal Arts and Human Sciences. We have with us distinguished guest and excellent scholar, Professor Anders Endberg-Pedersen. And the title of his talk is The Force of Aesthetics, Literature, Knowledge and War. Before Dr. Anders begins his talk, I request on the audience to please type in your questions on the question and answer tab section, and we will take them up once the talk gets over. So I'm now passing this on to Nakia, one of our panelists, who will be introducing the guest to the audience, and thereafter, Anders, you can start.
Absolutely.
Hello,
Nakia? Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, am I audible?
Yes, perfectly audible, yeah.
Professor Anders Endberg-Pedersen is a professor of comparative literature at the University of Southern Denmark. He holds a PhD in comparative literature from Harvard University and a DPhil in Neuere Deutsche Literatur from Humboldt University. Among other works, he is the author of The Empire of Chance, The Napoleonic Wars, and The Disorder of Things, Harvard University Press 2015. The editor of Literature and Cartography, Theories, Histories and Genres, MIT Press 2017, and the co-editor of Visualizing Wars, Emotions, Technologies, Communities from Routledge 2018. He is currently directing the collective research project, The Aesthetics of Late Modern War, sponsored by the Carlsberg and Wielix Foundations, and he serves as the editor of the new book series, Prisms, Humanities and War with MIT Press. With that, Professor, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me to give this lecture. This will be very fun, and I look forward to discussing it with you afterwards. I will just share my screen. Let's see whether this works. Here we go. So you can follow along with the visuals as well. Okay, well, let me begin in a somewhat distant period, namely in 1634, because in the winter of that year, Albrecht von Wallenstein, who was the supreme commander of the armies of the Holy Roman Empire, he was pacing a chamber in the Bohemian town of Pilsen as he was considering his options. In his mind, he developed one military strategy after the other, until he was juggling a whole array of possible futures. This is in the midst of the 30 Years' War, and Wallenstein found himself under increasing pressure. His Swedish adversary was edging closer, he was losing the trust of his employer, and even within his own ranks, questions were being asked about his leadership. Now, all of these threats were coming to head, and Wallenstein was keenly aware that he needed a plan of action. So to help him, Wallenstein turned to the stars. Since ancient times, beginning in Mesopotamia, the science of astrology had formed an integral part of military planning. And Wallenstein is the last commander known to consult astrology in matters of war. So here you see him. His chamber was therefore plastered with star charts, quadrants, globes, and other astrological equipment. At one point, Wallenstein, whom you see on the right here in the image, stopped in front of a so-called speculum astrologicum. It's a blackboard, and you can see it displayed in the back of this image, which displayed the positions of the planets. In accordance with the science of astrology, Wallenstein believed that the celestial constellations, the particular position of the planets at a given time, real events of the immediate future on Earth. So inspecting the speculum astrologicum, he suddenly noticed that they had aligned in a constellation that was very promising, and then he exclaimed, "Fortunate aspect." And Wallenstein thought, finally, the time for action had come. Now, this scene is actually entirely made up. It appears in Friedrich Schiller's play Wallenstein, which he completed in 1799. Schiller zooms in on the final days of Wallenstein's life before he was murdered in late February 1634. But as Schiller was well aware, this scene has a famous historical background. Not only was the historical Wallenstein beholden to the science of astrology, he had initiated a famous correspondence about the nature and power of astrology with one of the leading scientists of the day, namely Johannes Kepler. In 1608, Kepler had made a horoscope for Wallenstein. Here you see the horoscope. Kepler observed the various positions and alignments of the planets at the time of Wallenstein's birth and proceeded to predict a number of events in Wallenstein's life. He concluded that the horoscope, and I quote, was not a bad nativity, but contained exceptionally important signs. But Wallenstein wasn't satisfied. As the years went by, he felt that the horoscope and the events of his life fell increasingly out of sync. Some of the predicted life events had occurred too early, and some too late. So he asked Kepler to update the original horoscope. And now Wallenstein demanded new and very, very precise astrological predictions based on a careful recalculation and correction of the original horoscope. Kepler refused. He refused to offer the kind of detail Wallenstein wanted. And he even sent him a wry response in which he lectured Wallenstein on the limits of astrological knowledge. Astrology, Kepler writes, can predict only very general tendencies, but not particular events. And therefore, he concludes, it is a mistaken illusion to think that such accidentia, which mostly follow from the workings of the human will, occur in accordance with concrete, calculated events, celestial events, and can therefore be predicted. Now, in spite of these reservations, Kepler actually did update Wallenstein's horoscope, and he proceeded to predict a number of events until, quite remarkably, the winter of 1634, in which, as he wrote, a horrible disorder threatened. Now, in this overlap between scientific knowledge and war, this is what Schiller evokes in 1799 when he places Wallenstein in front of the blackboard with the planetary aspects. In Schiller's play, though, Wallenstein does not heed Kepler's warnings about the limits of the science of astrology. When he notices the favorable alignment of the stars on the blackboard in front of him, he's convinced of the scientific and metaphysical backing for his plans. Fortunate aspect, he exclaims. The time to transform the numerous potential scenarios he had developed in his mind into an actual decision has arrived. The time to act has finally come for Wallenstein. But Wallenstein does nothing. He ponders, he reflects, he evaluates his array of imaginary futures, but he refuses to act. As time begins to run out, first his military advisors urge him to make a decision, but to no avail. Wallenstein keeps thinking. Then his wife insists that he get on with it, but Wallenstein just keeps thinking. With increasing desperation, first his son and then his in-house astrologer both implore him to act, but Wallenstein just keeps on thinking. Finally, Wallenstein's sister-in-law, Countess Tersky, has had enough, and she says, the English is here on the left, the moment has arrived when you should draw the sum conclusion of your life's account. The signs of victory stand above your head, the planets nod good fortune from above and cry, the time has come. Is it in vain that all your days you have so closely told the courses of the stars, wielded the compass and the quadrant, painted on these walls the vault of heaven and the zodiac, and gathered about you with their silent, bodeful signs the seven lords of destiny? Was it an idle game that you were playing? Okay, now I begin with this scene today because it rather succinctly brings together and exemplifies a complex of disciplines and problems that has occupied me for some time. In this meeting of the towering figures of Schiller, Kepler, and Wallenstein, the fields of aesthetics, knowledge, and warfare become infiltrated in important ways. Schiller's literary work interrogates the character and functioning of a particular system of knowledge guiding warfare. When Wallenstein looks at the blackboard with the planetary aspects, he's looking at a knowledge order in decline. And by attending to Schiller's play written 150 years later, we get some insight into the development of the knowledge systems that guide warfare. Now, a closer analysis of the play would trace the shift from a metaphysical knowledge order based on astrology to an immanent knowledge order based on contingency and probability, and I've tried to do that elsewhere. But this Enlightenment play also asks us to consider some key questions in aesthetics, questions about the very purpose of art. Wallenstein creates a war imaginary of potential scenarios and imagined futures developed from the media available at the time. So horoscopes, astrolabes, and star charts. But are these imagined futures pure potentialities, that is, self-contained artificial worlds designed for detached aesthetic appreciation? Are they merely, as Countess Tieske says, an idle game, without any purchase on the actual world? Or do these imaginaries have practical consequences? Do they contain what Aristotle at one place calls dynamis, that is, the power to become real? What is, this scene then asks, the force of aesthetics? Now, in the past decade or so, I guess, I'm getting old, I have, among many other things, but mainly been working at this intersection of aesthetics, knowledge, and warfare. So I would like to take the opportunity today to reflect a bit on this work. More specifically, I want to think about the particular approach that I have tried to develop. So my talk is therefore less concerned with any particular content and a bit more with method. How might we bring together aesthetics, knowledge, and war, and why is it worth the effort? So the lecture is organized into these three parts. First, I'll be talking about war in literature, then war and the history of knowledge, and finally aesthetics and war. So why war? Now, if there's one question that I have often been asked, and I was just talking to about this, that one question I've been asked during the past decade, it is this: why war? Why does a scholar of literature work on the topic of war? And why would anyone want to associate the epitome of civilized thought, literature, art, aesthetics, with warfare? Do they not belong to two entirely different realms? Now, if historians or political scientists were asked this question, you would most likely have an answer ready at your fingertips. For it is very difficult, you might say, to offer a coherent account of the history of civilization without war. It is telling, you might continue, that when Cleisthenes introduced democratic reforms in Athens in 508 BCE, he introduced not merely a mode of government that has become foundational for societies, he also made war into a fully public activity. The democratic revolution, which gave birth to the remarkable cultural revolution of 5th century Athens that we in the humanities know so well, coincided with a revolution in military affairs. During the 5th century, Athens established the largest and most powerful military empire at the time and waged war on average in 2 out of 3 years for that whole century. As the classicist David Pritchard has put it, the 5th century demos judged their topmost public priority to be war. And indeed, theorists of statecraft have since stressed the so-called ontogenetic power of war, that is, the foundational role of war for the establishment of states. As Jens Bartelsson, a colleague of mine from Sweden, has recently shown, war has repeatedly been invoked as the force that establishes sovereignty and creates order out of the chaos of a mythical past. The most succinct modern formulation of this idea is, of course, Charles Tilly's famous statement from 1975 that war made the state and the state made war. But the literary scholar might say, it is just as difficult to conceive of literary history without warfare. From the invocation of the muse to sing of the anger that made Achilles into such an icon of both heroism and suffering in Homer's Iliad, via Sophocles' Ajax to Virgil's epic song of men in arms in the Aeneid, one may equally argue that from the very beginning of at least Western culture, war made literature and literature made war. Genres and subgenres, central conceptions of heroism, sacrifice, trauma, justice, nationhood, and so on, all emerge out of a 3,000-year-long literary engagement with warfare. That war in all its guises has remained one of the constants of literary history was exemplified only this fall with the controversial choice of Peter Handke as the recipient of the Nobel Prize in Literature, and with the polemics that ensued as critics sought to come to grips with the highly charged and complex relation between war and art in his work. Among literary scholars, there's been a renewed interest in understanding this long history. So spurred in particular by the wars in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and in Syria, a field has emerged that grapples with all the problems that the relation between war and literature entails. So here are just some of the important books that have appeared in English in recent years. In a different book, Kate McLaughlin put it quite eloquently when she wrote, "War reverberates through literature." As you can see, war has really come to reverberate through literary studies as well in recent years. Now, my own small contribution to this field has been to examine war, not so much to gain insight into the particular themes that we associate with warfare, the ones that I just mentioned, so suffering, heroism, trauma, and so on. Rather, the attempt has been to think more fundamentally about the way war functions as a prism. A prism in a sense that war is a force that refracts and transforms basic established categories of time, space, knowledge, and representation within literature and beyond it. I've taken my cue from a short passage in On War, in which the Prussian master thinker of war, Karl von Clausewitz, writes that in war, it seems as if the light of reason moves through different media and is bent into different rays than during speculative contemplation. What Clausewitz's brief comment suggests, and what his extensive writings examine in detail, is the character of this prism of war. For Clausewitz, war as a phenomenon constitutes a world unto itself, one that operates by different rules and in a different logic, and where different knowledge order obtains. Now, this conception of war immediately poses a problem. For how might we come to grips with a phenomenon that seems to refract, transform, or even deflect our fundamental cognitive capacities? Now, Clausewitz, he turned to historical examples. Only through concrete examples and historical accounts do we get a sense of the very complex texture of war, of its interwoven causal lines, of the disruptions and uncertainties that determine its operational logic. If we want to understand not simply the concept of war, as it may emerge in the brain of the philosopher sitting in their armchairs, absolute war, as Clausewitz calls it, but rather the phenomenon of war, war as it actually unfolds on the ground, then we need accounts that attend to the situated experience of war. At one point, Clausewitz suggests that what he calls ein erfundenes Beispiel, that is, an invented example, might hold as much, if not more, explanatory power than actual historical examples, if, that is, these invented examples were constructed properly. Now, my suggestion has been to turn to the invented examples that we normally call literature, and to examine in these archives of lived and imagined experience the logic and the knowledge order that organize them. To proceed in this way means to consider war not as a specific object or a theme, but as a matrix, a condition, a kind of state of things. War, in other words, is that which organizes what and how things appear to begin with. War is, if you will indulge me for a moment, what you could call the historical a priori of a mode of literature. The question we should ask then is this: how do the categories of time, space, knowledge, and narration appear in literary depictions of war at a given historical moment? So one key moment, which I have examined in some detail, is a period around 1800. If Schiller's Wallenstein, which I just mentioned before, in the 1790s, examined an earlier knowledge order, namely that of astrology. A series of literary texts by authors such as Heinrich von Kleist, Honoré de Balzac, Stendhal, Lev Tolstoy, and others registered the impact of the vast expansion of war that took place during the Napoleonic era. With what means could you describe and manage the incredibly complex phenomenon that war had developed into, its enormous extension and its numerous chance events? And how could you describe this with the narrative tools at hand? Was it even possible, or had warfare exceeded the realm of representation? These are the questions that 19th century authors had to grapple with. So I'll give you just two examples of this. The first is from really a non-existent novel. It was written by, or precisely not written by, Honoré de Balzac. So this non-existent novel is called, La Bataille, The Battle. Now, if you read Balzac's notebooks and if you read Balzac's letters, then you will know that he wanted to describe one complete battle from beginning to end. So he says, to write a novel entitled La Bataille, where you can hear the cannon roaring on the first page and the cry of victory on the last one. So this was his ideal. Now, he was extremely enthusiastic about this material. He did lots of research, traveled to the battlefields. He buys a number of maps. But he has one major problem, namely that he suffers from writer's block. He just cannot write this novel. The subject is too large, it's too complex. He's unable to find a novelistic form that will accommodate it. So the publication date is announced. It's postponed. It's postponed again. And finally, he confesses. You win. I haven't written a line of La Bataille, but I have put so much into it. Nevertheless, he fights on. And after a few more years, this was the complete result of his efforts. La Bataille, first chapter, Groß Aspern, on the 16th of May, 1809, towards the middle of the day. That was it. Now, anyone who knows Balzac's productivity will realize that it's a rather stunning failure. This failure of the emerging realist war novel is due to an internal conflict in Balzac's poetics. So again, if you read Balzac's notebooks that are copious, then we can see that he seeks both a total representation and a partial representation at the same time. So he wants a view from above that gives a complete overview of every single event, and he writes as if the reader observed it from a mountaintop, with all its accessories, uniforms, wounded soldiers, and details. And at the same time, he wants his novel to convey the situated experience of war. So he says, when you close the book, you will have seen everything intuitively and remember the battle as if you had participated in it. So the book stalls because of this inability to reconcile two ways of writing war. The case of Balzac, then, illustrates the degree to which war had become a representational problem. Not just commanders and strategists, but also literary authors had to come to grips with and find new ways of handling an intractable mass phenomenon. Some years later, however, Henri Beyle, better known as Stendhal, came up with a technical solution to this representational problem, and one that has since had quite an afterlife in both literature and film. For when Stendhal in the Charterhouse of Parma sends his very drunk 15-year-old protagonist Fabrice to war, he abandons the dream of a complete panoramic representation and depicts only a tiny fragment of the battlefield, namely the random movements of Fabrice as he roams the battlefield of Waterloo, completely disoriented in time and space and unable to see anything of what goes on around him. As the narrator is keen to point out, Fabrice understood absolutely nothing. Now, the effect of this, so the effect of placing incomprehension at the center of the scene and then writing war through incomprehension is rather interesting. By zooming in on Fabrice's experience on the battlefield, Stendhal surrounds him with what you could call a kind of plot cloud, a nimbus of potential events that at any time can emerge from the smoke that surrounds him. So the entire scene therefore consists solely of effects. Fabrice's one attempt at an autonomous action, his one chance to link a cause to an effect, comes when he shoots a Prussian soldier. It is later revealed that he missed. The soldier was actually killed by someone else. So the character of Fabrice therefore serves as a kind of meeting point, a narrative meeting point, for a number of intersecting events that have nothing to do with each other, except upon impact, they send him in a new direction. So we might regard Fabrice as a probe that has been submerged into the war matrix to make its operational logic visible. And this logic is one in which there's no linear relationship between causes and effects. The two have been unhinged to such an extent that causes have no effects, while effects seemingly arise out of without a cause, out of nowhere. Now, if the force of war led to the development of new representational forms and new poetics of the emerging 19th century war novel, war in Stendhal also emerges as a force so powerful that it not only refracts speculative contemplation as Clausewitz claimed it did, rather it shows the complete impotence of reason on the battlefield. In Stendhal's novel, war emerges as an utterly unpredictable and overpowering force beyond the purview of control and comprehension. Now, these are just two very brief examples of how warfare has impacted the very structure and coherence of literary worlds, testing the limits and the possibilities of literary representation. Later authors developed different solutions to the representational problem of war, but it is by attending to the structures and the poetics of their works that the changing historical conceptions of the state of war become visible. Now, literature is evidently not the only field in which the state of war becomes visible. A range of scientific fields and disciplines have been shaped by war. So military theory, obviously, but philosophy, mathematics, pedagogy, material culture of various kinds, cartography, war games. I'll mention just two of these that were shaped by war around 1800. And that is, as I mentioned, the development of mapping, of cartography, and the rise of the modern war game. Supposedly, Napoleon said this: "Une carte détaillée est une arme de guerre." So a detailed map is a weapon of war. Now, he probably never said this. You can't find it in his correspondence, but it actually fits his praxis very well. So the person who made it up made it up well. Because of a confluence of factors such as triangulation, state powers who were suddenly able to invest in mapping, and the extended nature of warfare, the map became a pervasive and indispensable tool of warfare around 1800. And Napoleon led the way by founding a number of cartographic institutions and making sure to always have maps at hand. And the mapping of Europe was, to a significant extent, a result of these military endeavors. But if you look at the maps themselves, then they offer very different pictures of war. At one end of the spectrum, we find maps of this sort. So what you see here is a more traditional historical map post factum. At the other end of the spectrum, however, we find sketches such as these. They present a very different cartographic space. What you see here is a small selection among 86 sketches that I found in a collection in Berlin. On the right side of the screen, you can see one by one how each, you can see how the maps have been glued together. So each map really constituted the limits of their spatial knowledge at a given period in time, and then they were glued together afterwards, so you could kind of make out the way that they were making their, that they were going through the landscape. So you see this thin line of spatial knowledge through an otherwise unknown territory. Now, if the first map, this one over here, represents the cartographic ideal, so a well-informed, ordered picture of war, these sketches here indicate the actual and much more precarious condition of knowledge of the people on the ground. Now, if military mapping was developed to handle the extended space of war, war games became a tool of handling the complex operational logic. How did war actually operate? Up until the Napoleonic Wars, war games were really just advanced chess games, as you can see here. But inventors soon sought to develop the games so they could simulate the complexities of extended, large-scale warfare. Here you see the board of a war game from 1797, which moves away from the abstract space of chess and instead seeks to represent the third dimension, namely the actual terrain. You can see that with the color scheme. Here's a different one that expands the board to allow simulations across an extended space. Eventually, actually, officers would play directly on topographical maps, such as the one I just showed you. Now, a minor revolution, however, took place in 1806 with the publication of this, the Opitz war game. With the simple introduction of dice, Opitz inserted contingency, chance, as the operative logic of the war game. Every intention was now dependent on the probabilities of the yes and no of the dice. The operational logic that I just described, Stendhal, or that he would describe later in the century, as a complete disjunction between causes and effects, is here domesticated, or sought domesticated, by immersing officers into a simulated world of war that offers them a kind of contingency training. In this way, the aim was that the soldiers and officers playing the game would not end up like Fabrice on the battlefield of Waterloo, having no clue. So folded into the material forms of these maps and games in the way they represent war, and formulated more explicitly in the discursive fields of philosophy and pedagogy at the time, we find then various conceptions of the nature of warfare, of its space, its temporalities, and its operational logic. Now again, I suppose we can ask, why would a literary scholar care about what goes on in these fields? Why is this relevant at all? Now, one of my goals has been to inscribe the literary history of warfare into the wider field of the history of knowledge. So this is a field that has a venerable genealogy going back to the French epistemological tradition from Canguilhem, Bachelard, and Foucault. I won't trouble you with that. But it has been much developed in particular in Germany in recent years. And its contemporary German version, it poses a number of meta questions about knowledge. How do fields and disciplines arise and develop? Which degree of scientific rigor do they have? What has historically counted as knowledge? And how is this knowledge represented? And finally, how have these representations then changed over time? So these are sort of some of the main questions guiding the history of knowledge. Now, a basic claim in this field, which was formulated by the German scholar Josef Vogel, is that every epistemological statement is inextricably linked with an aesthetic choice. So, to put it very simply, how something is represented really matters for what knowledge claim is made. So it therefore pays to examine the aesthetic staging, the mediation, and the organization of knowledge. What, for example, does the knowledge order of a topographical map, like the ones I just showed you, entail as compared to that of a fictional narrative or that of a graph or a wargame? Now, how then does war fit within this much larger history of knowledge? Now, my approach then is to think of warfare as an aesthetic phenomenon. So the premise here is that our understanding of war is inextricably linked to the way in which not just writers, but also map makers and inventors have built their representations of it. In other words, it is in the symbolic order, in the forms of the literary text, in the two-dimensional image of military cartography, or in the operational logic of the war game, that we can detect the conceptions of the state of war and its complex knowledge order, and how these conceptions change over time. But what then about literature? what is the status of the literary text if we use literature as an entryway into this much broader field of knowledge? Do we not somehow diminish the role and particularity of the literary? I think there are two answers to this. On the one hand, literary works appear side by side, that is, on par with other non-literary, non-fictional texts and material objects. So the rationale is, of course, to open literary studies and examine the ways in which literary works are entwined with other fields and phenomena that then together delineate a much larger historical development. But it does approach literature not always as sort of the end point of the investigation, but reads literature rather in the service of a more encompassing history of knowledge. On the other hand, literature in this approach nevertheless occupies a privileged position, I would say. Now, it does so first because it presents a number of scenarios, fictional laboratories of knowledge, we could call them, in which different knowledge forms and knowledge claims about war are reflected, debated, and tested. So if you look at Heinrich von Kleist, he suddenly writes about war games, Tolstoy writes about maps, and Schiller is engaged with the science of astrology. And second, I think literature is privileged because literature as fiction precisely puts its finger on this element of poesis, of aesthetic form giving in all knowledge production. Literature, I would venture, therefore comes to serve as the model par excellence for the shaping of knowledge more generally. So we could say that a history of knowledge approach allows us to view war as both a historical constellation, so diverse disciplines and events at a given moment in time, and as an aesthetic configuration of new forms, of new ways of representing. So thereby I sort of try to build a bridge between two more traditional approaches, the historical and the formal aesthetic, in an attempt to bring literature somewhat closer to its surroundings and show its wider relevance, but at the same time to maintain that this relevance stems from an essentially literary trait, namely that if we are to understand how war as a phenomenon has been conceived, we also have to attend to its basic aesthetic elements. Now, among these many fields and disciplines of knowledge impacted by war, there is one that has been surprisingly neglected. And it's a discipline which is very close to my home, namely literary studies. We don't have any systematic account of how literary studies has been shaped by warfare. So one of my current projects seeks to provide the beginnings of such an account. So with an Australian good colleague, Neil Ramsey, I'm working on one of these really suicidal book projects, a volume with 20 plus contributors called simply War and Literary Studies. Now, this book poses two main questions. First, how has war shaped the field of literary studies and the theories that inform literary studies? And second, when scholars today study the literature of war, what are the key concepts that are in play? Here is an overview of the book. I won't go into too much detail with this, but as you can see, the idea is once again to look through the prism of war in order to offer a new account of the discipline of literary studies itself, as well as the main theories and concepts that have shaped literary studies in the 20th and 21st century. Now, once we operate at this disciplinary level, we might actually notice an interesting parallel between the history of comparative literature and the history of international relations. It's well documented that the first efforts to establish international relations as a discipline after World War I had their roots in the desire to abolish war. Alfred Simon, who became the first professor of international relations in 1919, specifically advocated the creation of a global commonwealth of nations to this end. Similarly, in the wake of World War II, Hans Morgenthau, in Politics Among Nations, wrote that the abolition of war the abolition of war is obviously the fundamental problem confronting international thought. Now, if we turn to comparative literature, however, we find a similar idea expressed in one of its seminal texts, namely Erich Auerbach's Mimesis from 1946. As you are well aware, he famously wrote this book while he was in exile in Istanbul during World War II. And the innovative method of reading that he develops was an attempt to overcome the martial nationalism that had transformed Europe into a war zone. So zooming in on a range of very carefully chosen excerpts from the Odyssey to Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, Auerbach found in these textual fragments scenes of everyday human experience that transcended, he thought, distinct nationalities and political divisions. Uniting these texts and revealing in them moments of a universal humanity, Auerbach sought to recuperate a common culture from the hostility of war. As such, the book is both methodologically and in its overall aim a direct response to World War II. Okay, but let me briefly sum up before I move to the final section. So far, I've tried to examine war in two different ways. First, as a force that disrupts and reorganizes literary worlds themselves. And second, as a force that shapes a wider array of disciplines. That is, a force that shapes the history of knowledge, including the discipline of literary studies. Now, both endeavors involve a very clear directionality of influence. It is a perspective from war onto literature, and from war onto various disciplines of knowledge. In this approach, war is understood as the driver of change. The now deceased German media theorist Friedrich Kittler was very fond of quoting Heraclitus' all too famous aphorism that war is the father of all things. Now, even if we limit all things to literature, war in this account assumes the principal role of historical agent, while the aesthetic field grapples with the subsequent representation. So war comes first and aesthetics comes afterwards. More recently, however, I've begun pursuing a different line of inquiry. So this takes me to part 3, Aesthetics and War. And this work turns the direction of influence in reverse and asks, to what extent has aesthetics been a driving force of war? When and how has the aesthetic field been militarized and transformed from simple representations of war into tools of war and operations of war? These questions appear to have consequences both for the character of contemporary warfare, as well as for long-standing debates in philosophical aesthetics about the nature and purpose of art. Now let's go back to Wallenstein briefly. When Wallenstein's sister-in-law, Countess Tersky, asks her hesitant brother the central question of the play, was it an idle game that you were playing? She precisely puts her finger on this problematic. Did Wallenstein's war imaginary carry any force, any actual force, to act upon the world? Were the imagined futures he was constantly developing in his mind with his horoscopes and astrolabes and star charts, were they part of a serious calculation that was intended to be used? Or did they remain enclosed within the autonomous realm of aesthetics? What Wallenstein's sister-in-law seems to ask is the force of military aesthetics. For Schiller in 1799, the answer is evident. Wallenstein refuses to choose between his imagined plan of action, because any choice would limit his imagination and bind him to the real. Schiller casts Wallenstein as the ultimate aesthete, who refuses to relinquish the imagination to the real, who refuses to transform imaginary scenarios into a practical tool of action. He revels in the infinite possibilities of the mind and eventually suffers the brutal consequences of ignoring the actual war. With Wallenstein, as well as with his aesthetic theory, Schiller opens a gulf between the realm of the aesthetic and the realm of practical affairs. Play, for Schiller, belongs to, and I quote here, the unreal realm of the imagination, not to war. In recent years, matters have become somewhat more complicated. Since the turn of the century, artificial worlds have increasingly been co-opted as tools of war. Thus, imagined scenarios cinematic stagings, and immersive virtual reality simulations have come to shape how wars are prepared, waged, and processed. To remain at the forefront of technological development, the US military in particular has begun collaborating both with Hollywood and the game industry, as well as with academic institutions such as the ICT, so this is the Institute for Creative Technologies at the University of Southern California. This collaboration with filmmakers, designers, software programmers, and game developers has resulted in the widespread use of simulations and training scenarios such as Flat World. Here you see that, or a description of it. Known not as idle games, but as serious games, such invented military worlds have collapsed the means of representing warfare with the means of actually waging warfare. This merger of warfare and aesthetics offers a different, a more complex, and a more problematic answer to Countess Tersky's question. Games, fiction, the imaginary, do not belong to a separate realm of aesthetic appreciation. They do not mark the boundary to praxis, to action, and to operations. Rather, they form integral parts of the engines of war. Now, what does that mean? What does it mean for war, and what does it mean for aesthetics? The current research project, The Aesthetics of Late Modern War, which I'm currently directing, seeks to examine this at once rather fascinating and somewhat disturbing dialectic between aesthetics and war. Now, it takes on many forms. When military officers organize future conflicts around concepts such as suspension of disbelief, fictionality, and realism, what are the effects of the co-option of these aesthetic categories? How do they shape expectations? How do they shape perceptions? And what is the status of these curious late modern phenomena hovering somewhere in a gray zone between pure potentiality and actual destruction? In 2011, to take another example, the US Department of Defense issued the Planer's Handbook for Operational Design, which expounds the virtues of a novel concept of design in military affairs. A few years prior, General Mattis, who, as you may remember, later had a brief stint as Secretary of Defense under President Trump, and recently denounced him rather vigorously, had argued for the need for more creative thinking in warfare. The discourse on military design has responded to this call by importing a number of concepts and ideas from the arts to war. So I recently attended a workshop here in Copenhagen, where I'm living, on military design. And this workshop featured numerous references to furniture designer Charles Eames and to Picasso. Now, in this discourse, war is a matter of free thinking, of creativity, and of artistry. Adversaries are in turn transformed into a malleable material ready to be molded by the military designer. But this redescription of warfare as an artistic realm of creativity, of invention, of experimentation is anything but innocent. The whole vocabulary not only lends a positive, delightful sheen to the affairs of war, it also entails an implicit theory about the role and power of authorship and world making. Here we and they will do well to bear in mind the series of critical caveats in Clausewitz's much earlier reflections on the art of war, on Kriegskunst. For even as he thinks of warfare as an art, and frequently refers to generals and strategists as really artists, he emphasizes that the military strategist is working with and against ein lebendiges Material, so a living material. That the author is not the unrestrained demiurge as conceived by the classical literary tradition, but deeply limited in his efforts by the object itself. And that the whole creative endeavor is therefore shot through with an unwieldy and profound uncertainty. Now, these are just a few examples of the interlacing of warfare and aesthetics. But this way of examining the aesthetic character of warfare itself also has some wider methodological consequences. If war is pervaded by aesthetic artifacts, aesthetic categories, aesthetic concepts, and narratives, then what is needed is a perspective from the humanities to notice, to analyze, and to theorize war. What we need is a perspective that invokes the long and rich tradition of humanities scholarship to make use of its vocabularies, its analytical frames, and its theories in order to bring these analytical tools to bear on the changing character of war itself, not only on its representations in the arts. Now, to push this agenda, I fairly recently established a new book series called simply Prisms, Humanities and War. And as you can see, it precisely seeks to leverage the tools and the methods and the theories from the humanities in order to comprehend better the phenomenon of warfare. So let me end where I began. Why war? As I hopefully tried to show, a perspective from war in all its different guises offers important insights into literary history itself. So insights into basic questions about the structure, the developments, and even the possibility of writing literature. Conversely, a view from the field of aesthetics may open up novel perspectives on the changing character of warfare. And I think in light of recent changes, these perspectives have become increasingly necessary. So in a sense, this double perspective recapitulates the tension we found in Wallenstein between autonomy and use. Should literary studies, and more widely the humanities, be allowed to expand our horizons so we may revel in the marvels of knowledge, or should the humanities rather seek this knowledge only as an intermediary instrument to change matters of concern out in the world? Who is a proper humanist, in other words? Is it Wallenstein or is it Wallenstein's sister-in-law? Now, surely this is a false choice. We need both a theory of the stars, so to speak, and insight about practical affairs. But whereas a whole literature has sprung up around the literary representation of war, much less has been done on the practical use and force of aesthetics. And I think we would do well to spend more time studying the aesthetic operations that permeate war and leverage the tools from the long history of the humanities to understand them better. And I end here. I thank you so much for your attention.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Pedersen. Your talk was amazingly thoughtful, and if I have to use one word to capture your thought, to capture your talk, I would use the term warology. So, it was amazingly thoughtful, and you provided a fresh approach on war and its epistemologies, and you really managed to reverberate the war through your talk. I mean, the way war functions as a prism and establishes new domains of knowledge, while at the same time broadening our own, not only broadening but also questioning our understanding of war. And I like your idea of cartography and the horoscope that you used at the very beginning. So it is interesting to know how cartographies and horoscopes can also be used as methods, not only to know new places and favorable times for war, but also the way it triggers new kinds of wars. So it may as well refer to the new technologies of war that you have talked about in your latest book, which I was reading in the morning in the introduction. So on behalf of our university, let me thank you for the time that you have given to us and our students. And let us now see if there are any questions. Any questions from the audience? You may please put up now. There are a few questions. Should I read it out for you?
Yes, there seem to be quite a few. So if you'll just pick one, and I will see what I can do.
So the first question is from one of my colleagues from the School of Design, and Abhijit Pariyar. And Abhijit asks, is there any aesthetic difference between a pro-war and an anti-war literature? And that across different eras?
Oh, this is a very, very smart question. I think it's difficult to answer sort of it's such a perceptive but also large question. I think I find it difficult to give sort of a shorthand answer, but I can give perhaps one answer which goes through one of the authors that I've been working on, namely Heinrich von Kleist, because Heinrich von Kleist was he was a very pro-war author at certain times in his life. He wanted to go to war against France, and you can even see some of his plays trying to encourage the Prussian king to take up arms against France. Now, in one of these texts, which is called Hermannschlacht, you might say that there is a kind of limiting of nuance, a honing in on sort of basic emotions of patriotism that really go against some of the finer nuances that you find in other parts of his work. So when he comes to agitate for war, it becomes, in a sense, more primitive, I would say, than in some of his other writings. But you have to balance this with his with other plays that are less about encouraging the German population to go to war, or the Prussian population to go to war, and that are trying to analyze war, such as Der Prinz von Hamburg. So here he tries to analyze sort of military strategy and how it works and how it does not work. And that's a far more subtle play than you find in Hermannschlacht, when he really tries to advocate warfare. So my perhaps tentative sense would be that there's a kind of loss of nuance for the sort of the pro-war aesthetics that you will find, but it's really just an initial sense that one has to test. I think on numerous works of literature.
Fine. Thank you. Now let me take up the next question. It comes from one of our students, Rashi Hakim. It was very interesting talks. She begins with a comment. It was very interesting talk on looking at different aspects of war. I wanted to ask that how can we describe war as an aesthetic phenomenon?
Yes. So this I think goes really to the heart of the talk, where you can say it's in a sense enormously problematic to think of warfare as an aesthetic phenomenon. Does that not precisely take us away from the brutality, the pain, the force, the power dynamics inherent to warfare, and thus abstract ourselves in a sense out of the real of war? Now, I think that can certainly be the case, and I think you find works of literature that also somehow abstract away the really raw brutality of warfare, and in a sense idealize it. You find that in responses to World War I, for example. But on the other hand, what I was trying to say here is that if we think of aesthetics somewhat differently, if we think of aesthetics as a way in which representations organize our world, and representations determine what we are able to think, how we understand the past, how we understand the present, then it's very, very important to notice how these representations are made. And these are representations not just at the sort of level of political discourse that are, of course, rhetorical in various ways. They're also, and this was sort of the last part of my talk, they have now entered really into the very engines of war. So you find the military working with simulations, with games, with scenarios of various kinds that all structure the world, build worlds, and structure them in various ways. And in this sense, the world is a highly aesthetic phenomenon. And I think it's important that people who have some kind of understanding of how aesthetics operates, sort of literary scholars and scholars within sort of the broad field of the humanities, start thinking more about how these representations actually work, because they are now part and parcel of the actual waging of warfare. So they don't necessarily come after war. It's not as if you have sort of the brute reality of war and then 10 years later somebody writes a novel about it. No, now you have war being built and imagined in these representations, and they then end up shaping, forming, to a certain extent determining which wars will be waged, how they will be waged, and so on. So in that sense, not as aesthetics in the sense of sort of the idealized representation of the real, but rather as a producer of the real. I think aesthetics is enormously important.
Yeah, thank you. That was interesting. Next question comes from one of our guests, Shantanu Mazi from Kolkata.
Mm-hmm.
So he begins that you have elsewhere evoked Sushant Sontag's wide-ranging book, Illness as a Metaphor, to discuss the great deal of damage that illness metaphors cause to victims of specific diseases. Would you extend the argument in analyzing the trope of war that is currently being employed to explain the COVID-19 situation worldwide?
Oh, right. So I think you must be referring to this piece I wrote on precisely the metaphor of warfare at Boundary 2. Yes. So I mean, the whole piece was really an attempt to look at what some of the consequences are of thinking through war, and how warfare has been invoked as a, I think, really misleading metaphor. And that has not just been the case in the U.S. You found it in England. You found it in France, especially. Macron invoked war 6 times in this sort of famous speech he gave a few months back. But you found it really around the world. It's really difficult not to find places where war has been a central metaphor. Germany, interestingly, was not. Merkel was very careful not to speak of the COVID crisis in terms of warfare. But one discussion I had after I wrote that piece was, well, to what extent are we able to do away with metaphors speaking about COVID-19 at all? Because I think at the end I suggested maybe there's a different metaphorical complex which would be more apt, namely a metaphor of care and everything that comes with care. So in a sense, while criticizing, the use of war and saying, this brings us down the wrong track, I then suggested, well, let's use a different one. And in a way that can be seen as somewhat of a contradiction in terms, because I wanted to do away with metaphor. Now, I think we can't do away with metaphor. We also, in a sense, need metaphors to understand vastly complex phenomena. But at the same time, I think perhaps one possibility I was pushing and am pushing is that we need to then at least have a kind of metaphorical battle of metaphors, where we can see if we can do away with metaphors that really do not help neither for our comprehension of COVID-19 nor for the way that we act against it. So my suggestion there would be to let's find different metaphors, global metaphors that we can use to talk about COVID-19, because I think the only apt situation that we have found so far for the war metaphor is sort of rather the civil war metaphor, and how that might come to unfold, or at least tentative movements in that direction. When you saw in the U.S. how sort of militias turned up in, I think it was it in I forget, Wisconsin, I think it was, because they wanted an opening of the lockdown. So I think that was perhaps one of the few instances in which war might provide a reasonable frame for the events as they were unfolding. But otherwise, I would really caution against it. You need to turn on your microphone. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, and the next question comes from Sakshi, and she's one of our students, and she asks that can you highlight the distinction between theory and praxis of war in terms of aesthetics in the contemporary times?
If I understand the question. I'm not sure I understand the question.
Theory. I think she is probably trying to relate it to the COVID-19 phenomenon. Yeah, and how do you see as a kind of a praxis of war in the present in the context of the present situation? It is a kind of a battle that is going on.
So a kind of battle between what?
Between the virus and the laborers on one hand, and between the capitalists and the workers on the other. So we are in a state of a perpetual crisis.
Yeah. No. I mean, you're right, and I think as we perhaps also talked about before we went completely live. I think the effects of COVID-19 are, of course, really differentially distributed.
Yes, of course, that is true.
And it's very, very different to be a professor of literature at a university and to be the person who is the cashier at a supermarket. Having to constantly interact with people and not being able to sit like I am now in the safety of my home and yet have a conversation with you across the world. So in that sense, yes. I mean, there's this. There was, I think, initially a sense of unity also in Denmark. You know, a highly developed country where I think the problems, I can easily say, in Denmark are minute compared to the problems of the world, and also the distinction between the rich and the poor is just very little, very small in Denmark. And yet, what we quickly found is that people are there's a very big difference between those who are exposed and those who are not. So I'd say even sort of speaking from my own experience, it's very important to keep in mind that the unity that we may have initially encouraged with which to react to the COVID-19 crisis is really splitting up and leaves people in very different places.
Thank you. But one last question, and it comes from Isha Parmar. Can we say astrological prediction were also a cause of having war because they could create havoc? I mean, you gave one example. If you have some other examples that may interest our students.
Yeah. Well, so if you go back to some of the earliest material that we have about the link between warfare and astrology, there you can definitely say that astrology was I wouldn't perhaps say a cause of having war, but they were highly involved in deciding whether to go to war or not. So if in one of the examples from ancient Mesopotamia, you can see that King Nabuk was planning a war, and he kept postponing until finally the astrologer came and said, "Now you have the correct alignment of the stars." You wonder whether the war would have proceeded had he not done so. You also wonder in reverse whether the stars didn't somehow magically align because the king would like to go to war. So I think it's probably a more complex causal relationship than one might immediately imagine. But that they were highly intertwined is for sure.
Yeah, and actually, Anders, that reminds me that in India we had not one but a series of incidents where the kings they used to wait for the appropriate time, and when the astrologers used to tell them that now is the perfect time for you to go and unleash the war, so they used to embark on that. So there's plenty of stories related to it, which are fixated on the notion of astrology.
Right.
So maybe then that triggered that question from one of our students. Thank you again, Professor Anders. It was very kind of you to have spent time with us, and we look forward to have more engagements with you, maybe having you on campus when the time is appropriate and safe for all of us. And thank you once again. And I would also like to thank all the audience who are present here from different parts of India. So see you all. Bye. Take care.
Yes. Bye-bye. And thank you for all your questions. Bye-bye.
Thank you.